Now, before we get started on episode 5, we need to talk about how Imperial China was run bureaucratically and how the country was organized. Because right off the bat, we see this eunuch guy that's in a lot of stress. Now, we need to know a little bit about the social hierarchy and how eunuchs were perceived in order to understand why he's in such a distress. Imperial China was run by a very robust form of bureaucracy. Government officials, bureaucrats were divided into military staff and civil bureaucrats. They were also ranked into 9 different ranks. The lower the number, the higher the rank you are. First rank are the top ones in the entire country. Those are like prime ministers, chief of defense staff, defense ministers, generally the top officials in the entire country, and top military officers. And then you go down the rank to the 9th rank, which were your very low level of essentially civil servants. Frontline tax collectors, assistants to county chief or village chief, that level of government. Very low ranking. And then there are those that are government workers who weren't really ranked. Generally, if you're not even in the ranking system, you're lower than that rank. And where eunuchs lie is usually in the middle and lower part. No pun intended. Generally, eunuchs were guys that have been castrated, meaning they have their genitals cut off. And in case if you're wondering which part of the genital, because different countries had different ways of castrating guys, both as a form of punishment and as a form of creating eunuchs. We only have sources and actual people who survive into modernity to go by the last dynasty. So at least for the past 300 years, Chinese eunuchs usually have a Ken doll anatomy. They remove everything. And eunuchs generally wouldn't have much high rank. They never were high in rank. Manager of the rear palace was the highest ranking eunuch position, and that's only 4th rank. That's also what Jinshi refers himself to be, which, if he is that rank, he's 4th rank amongst 9 ranks, where only the top 7 kind of were important, and only 4th rank and above gets to actually see the emperor. So in terms of the ranked officials that the emperor sees, he's the lowest. And generally they are the lowest ones that directly answer to him. In terms of power though, because they were hanging around rear palace all the time, essentially the closest people to the emperor, they sometimes held more than nominal power. They held more power in terms of their influence on the actual emperors rather than their actual positions, which didn't allow them any power in particular. Now, other than official titles, eunuchs were very looked down upon by society, even though essentially the highest ranking eunuch was higher in rank compared to mayor of a city. But still, people look down upon them. They don't ever look down upon a city mayor, but they will look down upon a eunuch because essentially they traded in part of their body for a more cushiony kind of life. And generally in the traditional Chinese understanding and belief, you don't self-mutilate. You don't injure your own body. It's seen as disrespectful to your entire family. So essentially they were looked down upon. And for the very low-ranking eunuchs that didn't really have any rank inside the system, they were pretty expendable. As you can understand, that's why this poor eunuch is worried, because he may as well just be very severely punished or executed if people found out he's done something wrong, essentially. Now, if you go by the narratives of this show, you'd think that only eunuchs were allowed in the imperial palace. While that's partly true, it's not the entire story. Eunuchs were the only quote-unquote male allowed in the rear palace, aside from the emperor and any non-adult children of the emperor, or potentially previous emperor. If emperor's brother is not an adult, if he's still a kid, he gets to live in the imperial palace. But once you're considered an adult, you usually were given a house or like a residence of your own, and you kind of move out of the rear palace. Now, they were only allowed in the rear palace, but there's also a part of the imperial palace which was the front palace, where actual government officials work and where the emperor actually meets with officials to run the country. In that part, there's no restriction. What's interesting about this show is that they made a note about how the imperial doctors who were treating the imperial family were all eunuchs. Now, that's not really accurate in terms of actual Chinese history. They might explain why in this show later on, but in Chinese history, generally palace doctors were not eunuchs. They were doctors brought in from the outside. They were not eunuchs because they generally didn't really work inside the rear palace. They were working inside the imperial palace in general, but not the rear palace, only the front of the palace. And whenever they're needed, they're escorted into the rear palace, treat the patient, then came out. They don't get to stay inside, therefore they weren't considered too much of a threat. It's also not very practical, because the castration process is actually quite risky, given that there is no modern surgery technique or anything in ancient China. So there was a pretty high chance that you might die from it, and especially when you're old enough. If you're a doctor, most likely you're already an adult with family and everything. Whereas a lot of eunuchs would undergo the castration when they were very young. Like adults generally will have an even lower survival rate. And you don't want to kill your best doctors in the process just because you want to do that. So that doesn't seem very practical. So the story might explain why later on. Then we get to see Jinshi fencing with another guy whom I assume isn't a eunuch. And I guess, spoiler or no spoiler, I don't assume Jinshi really is a eunuch. For a few reasons. Usually the imperial palace was guarded on the outside, and palace guards were not eunuchs. Generally, eunuchs were castrated very young, therefore hormonal balance will change. We have surviving eunuchs up until the 1980s who are still living from the last dynasty. And if you check their physique, because the drop in testosterone, they actually lose a lot of muscle mass by comparison to other male, and they build up certain body fat. Essentially, their physiques will be a bit closer to old ladies by the time they were in the 1980s than old guys. They sound like old ladies, they kind of look like old ladies. You don't generally want them to be the guards of an imperial palace who are supposed to be essentially fighters. Therefore, I don't assume this guy who's fighting Jinshi is a eunuch, most likely a palace guard. And then, based on the physiques of Jinshi, it doesn't look like he's been castrated. Then we move on to Mao Mao actually foraging, and there are planted forests in the imperial palace. In Forbidden City nowadays, they wouldn't be old girls' forests, but you have trees, essentially. And whenever there are trees, you could potentially forage. It's not recommended, but you could. And what she's looking for is actually a form of mushroom. In the West, you know it by the Japanese name, which is matsutake. It's quite a delicacy in Japan, mainly due to the rareness. But it's quite much more common in China. The production is much higher. And more likely than not, if you actually go to Japan, the ones you buy from Japan are probably exported from China, because there's a higher abundance. It's still pretty priced. It's a really strong tasting mushroom, and a lot of people don't like it because of the strong taste. But others love it. Others can't get enough of it. And this is just one way in this show that they're showing of cooking this mushroom. They essentially just grilled it. But the most common way of eating it is you pan-sear it with some butter, and it brings out the flavor. It's kind of hard to explain, but you can go to a restaurant and just try to look up for one and give it a taste yourself. Now we actually get to see them preparing for a garden party, which happened pretty common back in Imperial China. It's usually a way of strengthening ties between the emperor and the higher ranking officials. Now it's worth noting that, remember we talked about government officials in ancient China having ranks? Those same kind of ranks actually also apply to rear palace. Not just for the eunuchs, also for all the servant ladies and all the concubines. Usually the empress and high-ranking concubines, like the 4 we saw over here, I'd assume that they are above rank, which just means that they're actually above our ranking system. They're actually higher than first rank in terms of the ranking system. That's only reserved for emperor and all the imperial families. So if you're a prince, then you're above rank. However, mid-ranking concubines and all the servant ladies, they will be ranked according to the system. It will be a rank equivalence. They generally don't hold the same kind of title as someone who has certain rank, but they will be paid equivalently by that rank. And by the way, they were paid, so it was a paid system, and their pay grade essentially will be equivalent to certain ranking officials and so on. What's interesting is that we saw Mao Mao actually sewing essentially a heat patch onto her clothes. We have something similar in ancient times actually. Not in terms of heat patch, because people usually did dress appropriately for the weather. They weren't freezing till death, let's put it that way. And there would be heating. But what happens is that in ancient China, in Imperial China, you had a lot of formality. You kneel a lot. And kneeling will be very bad for the knee if you do it like 1,000th time. So what they did is that they actually sew on knee pads inside their clothes. They wouldn't be visible, but it made them kneel much easier and more comfortably. Here's a further proof why Jin Shi may not be just a eunuch, based on the centerpiece in his clothes, which depends on the occasion. You will have more formal clothes for more formal occasions and so on and so forth. And his clothes had a phoenix in front. And these kind of symbol in the front usually symbolize your rank inside the ranking system. Different animals will depict different ranks. However, his one is a phoenix. Phoenix is not inside the ranking system. And it usually was only reserved for princes and in-laws. So if you're married to a princess, you get to wear this. So usually only someone in the imperial family gets to use a phoenix symbol, not your average official or the manager of rear palace, by that matter. And at the very end of this episode, we get a brief introduction of the actual garden party, which looks quite typical. It has Chinese-style dancing, it has a traditional Chinese band, and for the next episode, there's much more to talk about in terms of court antics and so on and so forth. But for now, we just had this preview of what's gonna happen next.